In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Until a warrior rises to power, a king chosen by the people. Torment, tragedy, and destruction follow Saul's days. Israel's first king falls on his own sword. A new king is anointed, a king chosen by God, David. A lowly shepherd, a boy with a sling, hunted by a jealous king. Yet even a man after God's own heart is still just a man. A man whose head could be turned, whose sword spilled innocent blood, whose knees were driven to the ground with a broken heart that only one could restore. One who will rule on David's throne forever. David, a king chosen by God, makes way for a forever king who chose us.
All right, hey, take your Bibles, would you please, and turn to 1 Samuel, the book of 1 Samuel. If you're not familiar with where that is in your Bible, there's a blue Bible in the pew rack in front of you. Go ahead and grab that one. If you don't have one, take it home with you. And we're going to be on page 250 today. We're just kind of going through the life, the gospel according to the life of David, and trying to look at the life of David and find gospel connections. But I want to begin, first of all, with this. How many of you have seen the trilogy Lord of the Rings? You know, I can barely go through a sermon without giving an illustration on the Lord of the Rings. For those of you who are non-Christians, who didn't raise your hands, no, I'm kidding. I would encourage you, there are all kinds of gospel types in that movie. I wouldn't let the kids watch it unless you watch it with them, but I think it's a great symbol of what the gospel can be. What's interesting is in the final movie, one of the last scenes, and this is going to be kind of a spoiler alert for those of you who've never seen it, but the whole point of the trilogy is there is a ring that it has great power, that anybody who uses it basically turns into a monster of a person. It brings out the worst in people, and it just gets them addicted to themselves and does incredible damage, this ring does. And the only way that this ring can be destroyed is if it is thrown into the mountain of doom, or Mount Doom, where it will be melted away. So Frodo, who was a hobbit, he is given the task of carrying this ring to Mount Doom, through all kinds of obstacles, all kinds of enemies, all kinds of people and creatures are trying to keep him from doing this. And he is just this faithful hobbit who is taking this ring, and he's going to get there. And one of the last scenes of the last movie is he and Sam are climbing up Mount Doom, and they get there, and he gets ready to throw it into the molten lava and destroy all evil in the earth for forever and ever. He's getting ready to do that, and he puts the ring on. He puts the ring on, and he knows what the ring can do. It brings out evil, it brings out darkness within the soul, but the hero of the story, fails. J.R. Tolkien, who wrote the story, he received all kinds of negative mail from people who really criticized that the hero of the story fails. He got all kinds. And he wrote back in several letters, and this is one thing that he wrote back in a letter about that. The power of evil in the world is not finally resistible by incarnate creatures, however good. He's revealing a worldview to us. He's saying the power of evil in the world is irresistible even to, quote, good people. No one can resist it, including hobbits. And what he wanted to teach people is no matter who you are and no matter how good you think you are a disappointment. Now, that's not exactly why you came to church today to hear, is it? Thank you, Craig. My dad told me that every day of my life, and now you're just reaffirming that for me. But the reason why I'm talking about this is because when we look into the life of people in the Bible, we want to see heroes and we want to see villains and we want to see a very clear line drawn between the two. The good guys and the bad guys. But that's not what we see. Even our heroes act villainous, and sometimes our villains act like heroes. And so it's really a disappointment. And when we look at the Bible, we find out the reason why of the disappointment. It's a 3-letter word that brings up all kinds of emotions in every single person here. The word is sin. Now, if you're a veteran believer, you've been around the church your whole life, this is where your mind's going to say, well, I can check out because I know about sin. I make oops all the time. I make all kinds of problems. I hurt people. Yeah, I know. I'm grateful that God forgives me. And so you just kind of move on. If you're not a Christian, the emotions of anger might come up because you think, oh, here we go, another fire-breathing Baptist preacher who's going to yell at me and point his finger and say how awful I am. That's what Christians do. We just talk about sin, 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 and we talk about everybody else's sin. If you're a brand new believer, and I find this to be true, if you're a brand new believer, sin is a very big deal to you because you know what you were saved from. It may have been that you lived a life of rejection of Christ, and now that you've accepted Him, you have accepted His forgiveness, and you are free, and that sin and talking about sin is still a big deal to you. That's one of the beautiful things about the Bible, is the Bible, it does teach us things about sin. It tells us some do's and don'ts, but one of the great things about the Bible is it tells us those do's and don'ts in the form of a story. It gives us men and women, heroes and villains, and that line is blurred between the two. And no matter what, they always disappoint. I think one of the reasons why sin is so good to talk about is for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps us see ourselves accurately. I know young people, by coaches and teachers and maybe even parents, you are told how wonderful you are, how good you are, and how great you are. And I'm not prepared to argue about that, but you know it's different. You know to the core of your soul that it's different than what your coach or your teacher has been telling you. When we read the Bible, it tells us that we have sinned against God, that is basically given God the finger every time we wake up in the morning. That's what sin is. And it's important for us to know that. And so the Bible is kind of a mirror for us, allowing us to see the reflection of ourselves, how God sees us. And without Jesus, He sees us as enemies. He sees us as people who have gone against Him. He sees us as foes. So the Bible is a mirror that kind of reveals to us who we are and what we are and how God sees us. But the Bible is also a window, and it tells us, it helps us see Jesus more clearly. When you have an extremely serious view of sin, you have an extremely serious view of Jesus and what He's done for you. When you have a serious view of the gravity of your sin, not the sins of other people, but your sin, the reality and the truth and the beauty of Jesus Christ and what He's done for you is very real every day. When you know that what you've been saved from, then you run to the Savior. And so when we talk about sin, that's kind of what helps us with this. And that's why I love this story between Saul and David. There are times when Saul acts like a hero, but really he's kind of a villain. And there are times when David, the hero, acts like a villain. And it's a disappointment in both of them. When you look at the stories, for example, we're not going to get into it because of time today, but in chapter 27, David is convinced that Saul is going to kill him. Keep in mind, at the end of chapter 26, Saul apologizes to David. He repents of his sin to David, and the beginning of chapter 27, David is saying, I don't believe it for a second, and he shouldn't have. And so what does he do? He goes across the border once again into Philistine territory, and he goes back to the king Achish. Remember the guy that David feigned insanity in front of? He goes back to him. And then David doesn't just do that, but David and his men, they live in the land of the Philistines, and they go out and they go after the enemies of the Israelites, and they completely loot and pillage and murder everyone because they don't want to have any witnesses. And then David comes back to Achish and says, yeah, we've been out fighting Jews. We've been out fighting Israelites. We've been out fighting your enemies, O King Achish. So King Achish is thinking that David is an ally when he's not. David is lying, he's manipulating, he's doing all the things that heroes shouldn't do. He's a disappointment. But then we come to chapter 28, and we see what's going on with Saul. And what I'd like you to have in your mind's eye, remember the old-fashioned compasses with the needle? Well, the neat thing about the compasses, and especially the finer ones, is the needle never stops. It's always moving. It never just stops on north and stays there and locks there. It's always wavering back and forth because of the magnetic field. I see that in the life of David. And that really is the difference between David and Saul. David's life, it is always on the trajectory going due north towards God, wanting to draw near to God, wanting to love God, wanting to be next to him, so that when David falls or when he sins, he repents and comes back to due north. Saul, on the other hand, he's a compass, and we see what's happening in chapter 28, really beginning in chapter 15, is just a steady decline. And there's never this snap back to his relationship with God, but it's always a steady decline. That really is the difference between David and Saul. It's not their performance, because both of them do some stupid things. It's not the frequency of sin. If we were keeping score, Saul and David would probably be tied as far as the frequency of sin. But it all comes down to that relationship, that David's needle is always pointed due north towards God and his relationship with God. And Saul's is a steady decline. We're going to look at Saul's today, beginning at verse 4. The Philistines assembled and came and encamped at Shunem. We're in chapter 28. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Now, scholars disagree on a lot of things when it comes to the life of David and Saul, but one of the things that they somewhat agree on is that by this time, Saul is in his 42nd year of reigning. He's well into his 70s. He's got 42 years of leading the nation of Israel, 42 years of leading them into battle after battle. This is a battle-hardened king. And he sees the Philistines, and what is his response? He is about ready to buckle in fear. So what do you do when you buckle in fear? You call out. When you're in desperation, when you're in panic, you call out to God. And he does that. Good for you, Saul. Verse 6. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets, which were the three basic ways that God spoke to his people back then. God would come in a dream and reveal his will. God would use one of the prophets to reveal his will. Or God would use sometimes what the people, the Urim and the Thummim are talked about in the first few books of the Bible. And our best guess is that they were two rocks. And on each rock were written in Hebrew, yes and no. And it was like the Hebrew version of a magic 8-ball. And if you wanted to do something, then you roll these rocks, and if it comes up yes, yes, then that's God saying, go and do whatever you want to do, whatever you're supposed to do. If you roll the rocks and it says no, no, then you don't. But if you roll the Urim and the Thummim and one says yes and the other says no, then you roll again. And it comes up no and yes, and you roll again. And that appears to be what Saul is doing here. He's rolling yes, no, no, yes, no, yes. God is silent. God is not even speaking at all to Saul. So what do you do? What do you do when you really need to know what the future holds? You really need to know how it's going to go for you in this battle. What are you going to do? Well, you do what he did. You call a witch. That's what he did. Now, last summer, when I told you that we were going through the life of David in 1st and 2nd Samuel, I would ask some of you in conversation, hey, what intrigues you about the life of David, or what intrigues you about 1st and 2nd Samuel? And almost to a person, you would say, yeah, what's with this witch of Endor? What's going on with that? What's up with that? Well, we're going to find out, and I promise you, you will be disappointed, okay? Here we go. Verse 7. Then Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, behold, there is a medium at Endor. Now, one of the things that God told the nation of Israel when they first went into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua is, when you go in, I want you to wipe everybody out, but I want you to especially get out all the mediums, the necromancers, which are the people that call up the dead, the tea leaf readers, the crystal ball readers, the astrologers. I want them all out. I want them out of my country. I want them out of my land, period. In fact, one of the good moves that Saul made is he did that. Look back at verse 3. Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the necromancers out of the land. So one of the good things that Saul had done in obedience to the Lord is get rid of all of these spiritists, these soothsayers, these necromancers, these people that would hold seances, get them out of the land. But now all of a sudden he's asking for one, and what a coinkydink, his men know exactly where one is. In fact, Endor is still technically within the boundaries of Judea, right by the Sea of Galilee. Hey, do you guys know of a soothsayer, or a necromancer, or a witch? Do you know of anybody like that? Yeah, there's one over at Endor. Go get her. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He said, bring up Samuel for me. So what do we do with this? Do we take this kind of stuff seriously? Witches, warlocks, Ouija boards, crystal balls, tea leaves, palm readers, astrology, horoscopes. Is it just a sham? Well, I'm by no stretch of the imagination authority on any of this stuff. And so I think, in my mind, that probably 95% of it is just a big con by really smart people who take a little bit of information about you, charge a lot of money, and tell you a bunch of stuff that they have no idea about. 95% of that. But there's a reason why God wanted those kinds of people out of his land, and that's because they are real. There is a spiritual world. We all believe that if we're here. We believe in this spiritual realm because we're here. And there are spirits of evil and there are spirits of good. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul, he writes this. He's concerned about the church in Corinth because they're going to temples and they're going and they're enacting part of the worship of that temple to a false god by eating meat that's offered to them. And they're thinking, it's only food, it's just meat, it's no big deal. It's not, it's fun. It's fun to go and be with our friends. It's not that big of a deal. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 says, yeah, you better think twice about that because this is what's going on. What pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Well, what's the big deal, Paul? Demons are real. Witches are real. Ouija boards, all those kinds that go into the dark spirits, those things are real. And so is this woman, is this what's going on here? I don't know. Tens of thousands of dollars that Debbie and I paid for seminary, and I'm telling you, I don't know. I don't know. But I do know this. She was surprised that it worked. Look at this. Verse 11, then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? He said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. Now, why did she do that? Why did she cry out? I'm thinking she cried out with a loud voice because, whoa, this is actually working. This person is coming up from the dead. And the woman said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a God coming up out of the earth. He said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. Well, what is the lesson here? I think that the very quick lesson is this. There is stuff going on in the spirit world that is very significant and very real, and we just don't understand. We don't understand it, and God is telling us, since you don't understand it, don't mess with it. Parents, are you hearing? Do not bring that stuff into your home. It may seem innocent. It may even seem fun. But if you were Satan, how would you want to get into your home? Fun. It's harmless. It's nothing. And you as parents need to make a decision about that. So, what do you see? What's his appearance? And she said in verse 14, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Saul knew this by now, and it killed him from the inside out. Samuel goes on, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. That's a strange verse. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Wait a minute. Shouldn't Samuel be more current? Shouldn't Samuel say, God is judging you because you have summoned a witch? God hates this. God hates what you just, he doesn't do that. He goes all the way back and gets historical. He goes back maybe 15, 20, 25 years to Saul's sin against the Amalekites. God told Saul clearly, I want you to wipe out everything of the Amalekites. I don't want you to take any bounty. I don't want you to take any loot. I want you to wipe them all off the face of the earth because they are wicked. And what does Saul do? They win the battle, but then he gets some provision and some bounty for his people. He disobeys God. And so Samuel comes to him and says, because you have disobeyed God. And Saul was defending himself. He says, come on, Samuel, it's not that big of a deal. We won the war. We won the fight. Lighten up. My guys, they worked hard. They deserve this bounty. They deserve this loot. And Samuel said, because of this, the kingdom is torn from you today. But then he also says this, very strange, in chapter 15. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. We've listened to that, right? To obey Jesus is better than just coming to church. If you're coming to church today because of something you did yesterday, thinking that's going to balance out, then Samuel's talking to you. But then he goes on, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams, for rebellion is as the sin of divination. Why did Samuel bring up the sin of divination? Because he's going, Saul, you are minimizing this sin. You are saying it's not that big of a deal. Everybody does it. Everybody loots. Everybody gets bounty. Everybody lets people live. Everybody does that. Everybody disobeys God. We're all doing it. It's not hurting anybody. Saul, what you just did in your disobedience against God to the Amalekites, it is as bad as the sin of divination. Oh, listen, okay, so it's the February issue of Sports Illustrated. It's the bathing suit issue. It's this one thing. It's not a big deal. That is just as bad as the act of adultery in God's sight. Okay, it's just this. It's just a small thing. It's just for my taxes. It's not a big deal. That is as big as robbing a bank in God's sight. That's what Samuel's saying. And don't you think it's odd that here we are, fast forwarding a few decades, and here Saul is. He is talking to someone committing the sin of divination. Now, if you were to tell him back in 1 Samuel 15, Saul, do you realize that in 10 or 15 or 20 years, you are going to be consulting a witch? He'd say, there is no way. There is no way I would ever do that. Those people hate God, and God hates them. There is no way I would ever go to a diviner or a soothsayer. And yet, here we come to chapter 28, and there he is. That is always the trajectory of sin. Always the trajectory of sin. Here's a 3-line. I'm going to go back on the 3-line. Thank you very much. Sin will take you further than you want to go. Sin will keep you longer than you want to stay. Sin will cost you more than you want to pay. Just leave this up here for Colette, because I want you to write that down. Parents, write that down. Young people, write that down someplace. Know this. Because that sin that you think is very, very small, it's not a big deal. I know that God dislikes it, and I know that it can harm me, but I think I can manage it. I think I can manage it. I think I'm okay with that. Sin will always take you further than you want to go. Sin will keep you longer than you want to stay. Sin will cost you more than you want to pay. I think Samuel is saying this to Saul in 1 Samuel 15, because by chapter 28, it will cost Saul far more than he wants to pay, because it kept him longer than he wanted to stay, and because it took him further than he wanted to go. That is the power and that is the authority of sin. Let's read on. Verse 15, then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Saul answered, I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me and answers me no more, either by prophets or dreams. That's why I've called you, Samuel. Verse 17, the Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, Samuel saying. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore, the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. Saul, you want to know what the future holds? You want to know what's going to happen? I'll be seeing you tomorrow. And it won't be up here. I'll be seeing you tomorrow. You're going to be, you brought me to be with you. Tomorrow, you're going to be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines. Well, you can imagine Saul's response, verse 20. Then Saul fell at once full length on the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten nothing all day and all night. And the woman came to Saul And when she saw that he was terrified, she said to him, "Behold, your servant has obeyed you. I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to what you have said to me. Now therefore, you also obey your servant. I've obeyed you, now you obey me. Let me set a morsel of bread before you and eat, that you may have strength when you go on your way." Saul refused and said, "I will not eat." But his servants together with the woman urged him, and he listened to their words. So he arose from the earth and sat on the bed. Now the woman had a fattened calf in the house, and she quickly killed it. And she took flour and kneaded it and baked unleavened bread of it. And she put it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. Then they rose and went away that night. Saul wanted to be a hero. He wanted to be the guy. So what I want you to do is I want you to have a slideshow with only 2 slides in your mind. I want you to go back to the first part of 1 Samuel, if you're with us last summer. And we have Saul. What is our first sighting of Saul? He is a young man from an insignificant tribe. There's nothing about him. There's no wealth. He's just a guy. A normal guy, like any of us guys in this room. Nothing about him that's special except his looks. And what do we see him doing? The first scene that we see of Saul is he's looking for his father's donkeys. That's all he's doing. He's looking for his father's donkeys who have ran away. What a good son does. And somewhere along the way, he meets Samuel, and Saul hits the lottery. He becomes the people's choice. He becomes the king. And the people love him. And Saul loves the people. And great things are happening in the kingdom. And Saul is growing in stature. And he's looking more and more kingly because that's what the people wanted. They wanted a king like everybody else. So here's this king wearing the cape, blowing in the wind. That's Saul in his own mind. He is a hero of Israel. And now fast forward 42 years. And what is the final scene that we see of Saul? He's having his last supper with a witch. He is overwhelmed with grief. And he's having his last supper with a witch. The king of Israel. The first great king of Israel, the hero, and the one they sang about. Saul has killed his 1,000 and David his 10,000. Eating with a witch. Sin will take you further than you want to go. Sin will keep you longer than you want to stay. Sin will cost you more than you want to pay. You might be here this morning and you are realizing that for the first time. It could be that you are here because you don't know what else to do. Maybe you've even tried soothsayers and witches and mediums and warlocks and crystal balls. You've tried everything. And you're here today as kind of this last-ditch effort. And these words are ringing in your mind because you can trace it back. You can trace back your past choices. And now here you are. It is costing you everything more than you want to pay. This may be the best day of your life. Not because of this sermon and not because of Saul, but because of Jesus. Amen. You see, don't you think it's ironic? And maybe it's on purpose. I don't know. I'd like to think it is. Here is the king of Israel, and in 24 hours, in less than 24 hours, he's going to be dead. And we have a picture of his last supper. And then we move forward 1,000 years. And there's another king, the king of Israel. And he's in a room, a clandestine room, much like Saul. Nobody knows. And he's having his last supper because in less than 24 hours, he too will be dead. Now, the king in 1 Samuel, he is going to die in his sin. The king in the Gospels, Jesus, is going to die for your sin. And all of a sudden, we begin to see the beauty of this. And maybe you can think about it this way. Jesus will take you further than you could ever hope. Jesus will keep you longer than you could ever imagine. Jesus bore the cost well beyond what we could have paid. Yes, I know sin will take me further than I ever thought I would go. Sin will keep me longer than I will ever thought I would stay. Sin will cost me more than I ever thought I would pay. But, and yet, Jesus. Amen. Jesus will take you further than you could ever hope. Jesus will keep you longer than you could ever imagine. Jesus bore the cost well beyond what we could ever have paid. And why? Because Jesus died. He died to forgive you of your sins, to pay for the sins that you and I commit, so that you and I could be completely free. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful if we could just tell Saul, listen, all you've got to do is make sure that needle is pointed due north. Come on, buddy, repent. Own up to it. Quit justifying and minimizing sin. Own up to what you've done and run before the Father. Saul, come on, do what David has done. It's so easy to counsel somebody else in their sin, isn't it? How about you? How about me? Maybe I need that. Maybe I need the counsel that I would give Saul. Is my compass in my life and my heart, is it trajectory always going towards Christ? Is it always there? Or like Saul, is it going down, 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 down? And it takes me further than I ever thought I would go. It keeps me longer than I'd ever stay. And it costs me more than I ever pay. This is that moment when we come to Jesus and we say, Jesus, because of your death, your burial, and your resurrection, I'm trusting that you will take me further than I could ever hope. I'm trusting that you will keep me longer than I could ever imagine. I'm trusting that you bore the cost well beyond what I could have paid. That is who Jesus is.
Thanks for watching. Find out more about the Arcade Church community at arcadechurch.com.